Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar, Charging Ahead, the State of EVs in 2021. I'm Shereen Othman, Communications Specialist at Lincoln Electric System, and I will help moderate today's session. Just a few things to note before we get started. Today's session will be recorded and shared on les.com/gogreen, where you can watch a replay or share it with others. It is set to listen view only mode, so if you have any questions, just use the chat box and we'll get them answered. You can find the chat box here at the bottom of your screen. So just use that and we'll help moderate the questions. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Marc Shkolnick, Manager of Energy Services at LES. You're on mute, Marc.
There's very little that typically keeps me from speaking, but mute is one of those things that'll do it. So let's see, do we have my screen being shared here? Can you see the presentation?
I can see it, Marc.
Okay, I just want to make sure everybody can see the full screen. Good afternoon to everybody, customers, to our colleagues across the company who've joined us this afternoon to talk a little bit about electric transportation. I'm Marc Shkolnick, Manager of Energy Services. I'm going to provide you with a very brief overview of some of the things that Lincoln Electric System's been doing over the last several years in the space. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not. But the real crux of this next hour is our subject matter expert, Jamie Dunckley from EPRI, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I'm looking forward to having her present on current trends in the electric transportation space. So in terms of the role that LES has been playing in electric transportation over the last 6-7 years, really the first area that we've been very active in is in the research space. And that's really understanding the human element and the technical aspects of electric transportation. And it's really around a variety of questions. For example, how quickly will customers adopt this emerging technology in Lincoln, Nebraska? And what will serve as barriers to adoption and what might accelerate adoption? Where, when, and for how long will customers charge their vehicles at home? And how does that coincide with our system peak demand that occurs on a day like tomorrow, for example? It's going to be really hot and humid. Does everybody charge at the same time at home, or is there some diversity in the time of day when people charge their vehicles? How is public charging infrastructure going to be utilized? Will it be used a lot or a little? So that's really one area that we've really begun to focus in on the last several years. Another area is promotion, and that what I mean by promotion is how can we collaborate with public agencies, private businesses, and organizations to facilitate adoption? How can we leverage resources, financial and subject matter insight to facilitate folks' understanding and engagement with the technology? And the third area of activity is public engagement and education. And I guess my observation in the last few years is that it's not just good enough to provide information to folks about what an electric vehicle is. I would say that buying a car is a lot more emotional than buying an LED light bulb, high efficiency heat pump, or water heater. You just don't have the same emotion. I know a few on this call, on this web chat, may have an emotional attachment to your water heater, but when you're buying a vehicle, that's a whole different ballgame. People have very strong feelings about the vehicle they're driving. In terms of safety, in terms of the color, in terms of features, in terms of the range, all of these different kinds of things. And so, so this is a very different type of technology than the typical energy efficient technologies that we're used to working with. And so we need to engage customers. We need to engage the curious customer with those customers who've made the leap, who've purchased the vehicles. Because in terms of mass adoption of electric vehicles, it seems to me we won't get the early majority involved until they're sold on a variety of things that are really important to them. Early adopters tend to not worry too much about range or cost. They just want the new technology. And there are others that really want it because of the environmental impacts, the positive environmental impacts. But a lot of the early majority, they're looking at cost, and they're looking at range, and they're looking at how does the car look. And those people need to feel a trust in the technology, and you can accomplish that by visiting with folks who actually own and drive the vehicles. We also need to get rears and seats to experience the thrill of driving an electric vehicle. So these are the areas that LES has really been putting focus on the last several years. And a little bit more about research. So you may be aware that we have conducted for several years a residential charging study using this little device from Fleet Karma that we, I think we had 85 EV owners involved in, and it's data logger, and we're getting a lot of insight into when charging is occurring at home, so we can better understand the impact on the grid. So that's been an ongoing effort. We've even added a demand response component this year, which means that on a day like today, we have, I think, 60 or so customers in the third year of the study. We can send a message to them and say, hey, do you want to charge your vehicle off peak hours? So you can reduce the impact on our peak, and in exchange for that, we'll provide you with a billing credit. So we're testing that out to see how customers respond. So that's some research that we're undertaking. We've also worked closely with EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. We were involved in a study a 3 years ago to better understand the drivers and barriers to EV adoption and attitudes towards EVs, and what incentives would be effective and which wouldn't move the needle a whole lot. We learned a lot in our work on that study. And then we've also had hands-on experience with this technology. We've incorporated hybrids and plug-in hybrids and all electrics into our passenger fleet at LES. And so we've really got an opportunity to really understand the technology. We've also installed a couple of community public charging stations down in the Haymarket. We were the first ones to get community public charging infrastructure in the ground back in 2014. And so we've really begun to understand the utilization of those charging stations and what's working and what's not. Promotions, just some specific examples. We collaborated with the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy in promoting rebates to private and public organizations, private businesses to install public charging. And these monies came from the Volkswagen settlement funding, and they were administered by the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy. And we effectively were able to work with the university, BNR stores, Lincoln Public Schools to effectively double the number of public charging stations in the community, and particularly in areas of the city that were not covered by public charging infrastructure. Most of it was concentrated downtown. Well, we've effectively doubled. We've got now, 20. We've got about 40 different charging station locations. The little circled areas are the new ones that were added because of the funding from the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy, as well as some LES funding. The customer also had financial participation and made this all possible. And then we also collaborated with the Nebraska Environmental Trust. We received a $120,000 grant in 2020, and we were able to fund 26 EV purchase rebates for customers who were purchasing their first either plug-in hybrid or all-electric vehicle. And so that's some of the promotional work that we've done. And then finally, in the area of public engagement and education, we established an EV interest group, which is now over 200 folks that are either curious about EVs or own EVs. And we've had a little breakfast like the one you see here in this picture. This was taken in 2019. And so we get folks together and we talk about EVs and we talk about some of the trends and things of that nature. But our real big event is coming up this Saturday, and that's an EV ride and drive. It's the first major EV ride and drive that LES has undertaken, probably one of the first in the state of Nebraska of scale of its kind. Some information about the EV ride and drive event coming up Saturday. It'll be held between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. out at Haymarket Park in the parking lot, lot 20 out there. And the objectives of the event is to provide experience for test drives, to engage curious customers with EV owners, and to provide some education through some seminars that we'll be offering out there that day. We had 150 customers pre-register to test drive, but we have 10 EVs available to test drive. We'll have some capacity to handle folks who walk up to the event. So if you didn't pre-register, we still want you to come out and enjoy the event. And we should have enough capacity to handle walk-ups to do some test driving. So we're going to have those vehicles. We are going to have 11 different makes, vehicle makes, and 17 different models that'll be on display in the event space itself. We have over 40 EV owner volunteers that are helping out in 6 local dealerships that are providing vehicles for test drives or display. StarTran is providing their electric buses for those who wish to shuttle over from the Haymarket over to Haymarket Park. We'll take them out and bring them back. So if you want to experience what the EV buses are all about, you can take a shuttle ride down on Canopy and Q Street starting at 10 o'clock on Saturday. And so we've also partnered with a nonprofit out of California called Charge Across Town. They've done hundreds of ride and drive events. And so they've been very helpful in consulting and determining the best way to create a very positive customer experience for ride and drives and test drives of these vehicles. This is just a little overview of how our event site will be laid out. Folks will enter through this lineup of EVs, check in, and they'll have the opportunity to visit with owners in these various tented areas around here. We'll have some dealership displays down in this area. Really, the experience zone, if you will, be the test drive area. So folks will get to experience electric vehicles. They'll get in the vehicle with a dealer or dealer rep, learn about the vehicle, and then take it on a test drive about a mile around the stadium on a closed track. And our engagement zone, as I mentioned, is going to be in this area where you can visit with EV owners. And then finally, we'll have this education zone where we have Dr. Don Cox, who is an EV enthusiast and subject matter expert, who will be providing an overview of the electric vehicle basics. And those workshops will be offered 3 different times throughout the 10 to 3 p.m. time period of the event. So essentially, that is what we're doing. And I don't know if there's any comments or questions before I introduce our keynote here, Shireen, if there's anything that's popped in.
No, we don't have any yet.
Okay, very good. Very good. Well, there'll be certainly time for conversation after Jamie's presentation, but really excited to have Jamie Dunckley involved with this web discussion today. Jamie Dunckley has been with EPRI for 7 years, serving as data scientist, technical leader, and for the past 9 months as senior project manager. She edits and publishes monthly EV market update, the annual EV consumer guides, and has worked with utilities on studies focused on customer adoption and other areas of consumer research. Prior to her arrival at EPRI, Jamie spent 6 years as an oceanographer for the Center for Ocean Solutions, developing the Kelp Forest Observatory off the coast of Monterey. She holds bachelor and PhD in environmental engineering from MIT and Stanford University. And I'm really honored to introduce Jamie Dunckley.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen here before we get started. That ride and drive sounds great. I'm very jealous.
Okay. There we go. We got your PowerPoint.
All right, and I'll make it presenter mode here. Does that look good?
Looks like we're still seeing your PowerPoint layout screen.
Try this again. Does that work?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So I can't see the question and answer currently. So please please interrupt me if you have any questions. So again, Mark, thanks for the introduction. Just a quick thing about, or quick kind of information about EPRI. So we're a nonprofit, and I work with about 50 different utilities in the US, helping with a number of different kind of questions that come up with electric vehicles. Yeah, we get all sorts of flavors of questions coming in. So I'm happy to provide kind of an overview of what we're seeing, and kind of stemming from that work. So we will be taking a dive into kind of more local statistics, but I like to start with the idea that, electric transportation is a global market. So, we're seeing sales rise in the US, and I'll show you some more stats on that, and that's great. But there are other places that are also kind of navigating this adoption, and they're doing it in different ways. I like to highlight here, in kind of the numbers there, Norway has 74% of their new vehicles purchased are electric. Iceland also has high rates. And if you look in the light blue in the middle here, in Europe, the EV sales jumped last year up to 12%. So there was some new legislation that was put in, or regulatory guidelines that were put in last year. So Europe corresponded. China has a little bit less kind of percent of new vehicles that are electric. However, their population is very large. So they actually have the largest EV market. We're seeing in the US that we're looking at about 2.5% of all new vehicles are electric. So that's been growing over time. But again, sort of as we think about how regulations in the US might be changing, or states may have their own objectives, the OEMs are responding to a global market. So even if there are some kind of changes here, they're in the long game. So as we see kind of adoption happening internationally, it'll start to affect what we're seeing in the US as well. And this kind of adds some more detail to that last slide, but I've listed here on the left all of the different areas, including states and countries that have pledged to go to have a ban on internal combustion engines. And there are more added to this list all the time. So, a lot of times these are kind of North Star goals, but the intention is to slowly phase out internal combustion engine vehicles. Down on the bottom here in kind of the light blue, there are also quite a few announcements by OEMs. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of the subtleties that might be in those announcements, because there are a lot of them, and they often say, we will be going electric by a certain time. But there is a subtlety to that. So I'll start with this, and this may be kind of old news for a lot of you, but I do like to highlight that, there's kind of three different, well, four if you include the internal combustion engine, but, when we're thinking about electrifying vehicles, there's the hybrid, there's a plug-in hybrid, and then the battery electric, or the BEV. And a lot of times when OEMs are making these announcements, they include the hybrid electric vehicle, which does have a battery. It is more efficient. So it's great that they are moving more towards these vehicles, but there isn't a plug. So in terms of a utility motivation here, you guys and us, we care about the vehicles with the plug, because that's something where, you can actually get energy from the grid to power your vehicle. So anyway, just some subtleties. I will be using the acronym plug-in hybrid as well as battery electric, or BEV, throughout the rest of the presentation. Okay, so I said sales continue to grow. They do in the US. So this is a plot showing the sales of all electric vehicles, again, plug-in hybrids as well as battery electric vehicles, from 2012 up into May of this year. The dotted line here shows the percentage of those sales that are battery electric, and the solid line are plug-in hybrid. So right around June of 2015, actually, we started seeing more battery electric vehicles outselling the plug-in hybrids. So one thing you'll notice here, and I'll have another slide in a second, the predominant seller is Tesla. That probably surprises none of you. So Tesla has more than 50% of the new vehicles getting sold currently. And you can see that they're not quite half, but they're a good portion of the overall total sales, even from 2012. And we can probably talk for days as to why that is. I think, one sentiment that I hear quite a bit is that, the early vehicles on the market, whether it was the Leaf or the Volt, kind of the small city cars, they were sold as kind of green cars or helping the environment. And not that folks don't want to do that, but that targets itself to a certain demographic. And Tesla you never heard them say that. They were kind of bragging about the exterior, the amazing driving ability of the car. They sold just a really awesome car, and I think that went over a little bit better. So there's also they've got a great charging infrastructure. So not to say that the other vehicles aren't having that they don't have great offerings as well. It's just Tesla was kind of early to the market. So I think we'll see this shifting in time as people get more used to these vehicles and more come to the market. So I showed that the sales were increasing over time, and there's we've seen growth. However, the growth is not distributed evenly. So this is a map of the United States portioned by county. And these are the share in the county of new vehicles that are electric. So not the overall portion of vehicles that are electric, but just the new vehicle share of this past year. So May of last year to April of this year. And as I pointed out in that slide before, we're looking at about 2.5% nation average of new vehicle sales being electric. However, there are lots of places that exceed this. So the top one here, Santa Clara County, where I lived for 4 years, is at almost 20%. But you also see quite a few other ones that have high percentages here. If you were to make some generalizations, the early vehicles, they're expensive. So places that are higher income, places seems to be kind of more coastal regions, although we see some growth in Colorado as well. But there's more pockets that are showing kind of higher adoption rates. So again, there are lots of things that influence whether someone buys an electric car or not. And as Mark pointed out too, it's a very emotional decision. And so we're doing work to figure out what incentives are most effective, why some people choose to buy one in one place versus another. But I often, similar to, I guess, to Mark's sentiments, vehicles aren't heat pumps. So there's a lot more to it than that. And so similarly, we see quite a varying adoption spread. Mark, are there any questions coming in, or should I keep on going?
We don't have any questions yet, so keep on going.
Okay. So at this point, I have 4 slides, just kind of pointing out some trends we're seeing to kind of help contribute. Yep.
You might go back to that map and explain the ZEV states and how those are distinct from the rest of the country.
Yes, great point. So we have a number of ZEV states, so zero emission vehicle states, where the states have decided to kind of follow California in mandating a certain number of OEM vehicles that have to be electric. And so the OEMs have to meet certain targets within those states. And so it tends to be that for those states where they have these quotas they have to meet, the vehicles are there first, and there tends to be a little bit more variety. So, we often are looking at, when I'll say, in California, we saw this at a dealership, I often get someone to raise their hands like, well, what about in Knoxville, Tennessee? Like, well, I haven't seen any of those vehicles. And that's partially because there's motivating factors for the OEMs to kind of get the vehicles there first. And more states are following suit. As you've seen, kind of the dotted ones there are states that have pledged to be zero emission vehicle states. Okay, so for these next 4 slides, I'm going to just talk about trends that we're seeing. These 2 plots are AC charging, so level 2, kind of a lower power level, so you charge for longer charging, and then DC charging, which tends to be faster charging. And this is over the US, and it's just showing the number of connectors, like the physical plug that you'd plug into their vehicle and that growth over time. So again, similar to the vehicle sales, these are growing. They're growing in all shapes and sizes. And what I mean by that is kind of the way that they're set up. So you sometimes find them at a grocery store, they could be at a hotel, they could be at a school, at a library. Sometimes there's a site host that owns them. Sometimes some other company will own them. And then, different people are responsible for the maintenance. They may be free. They may be, you may pay for them by belonging to some kind of a network. There's lots of flavors there, but they are growing over time. Obviously, you'll see kind of on the AC charging where you're plugged in longer, you need more of those versus the DC charging that is good for kind of road trips, as well as for those who don't have a garage. There tend to be fewer of those, but they're definitely necessary to support electric vehicles. I will say at this point, it's a little bit of a wild west in terms of how. So I guess for the AC charging, there's one connector that works for everyone outside of Tesla. And so it's made it very easy to kind of roll out the charging infrastructure that everybody can use. On the DC charging side, there are 3 different connectors. I think we're kind of focusing in on 2, which is the Tesla and the CCS connector, but it does lend itself to a bit of confusion especially amongst newbie EV owners. I think the conversation has started, it started with range anxiety. Will I be able to make it to where I need to go? And what I've been saying more recently is it's more of a charger anxiety. So I know I can get there. I trust my car, but if I get there, will I be able to play? Will it be the right connector? Will there be a long line? Will someone be parked there so I can't access it? So this is something that is still active in terms of what is the right way to do it. And I would say there's probably not one right way to do it. There's lots depending on where you are, but bottom line, we're seeing growth over time. It helps with customer confidence, but we're still working out the kinks in terms of the best way to move forward to kind of offer seamless charging for everyone.
We do have a question, Jamie.
Okay.
What kind of investigation has been done looking at carbon footprint or emissions total throughout all processes over the lifetime of EVs, especially when compared to the footprint of existing used IC vehicles? So whether it's production, manufacturing of a car, batteries, mining, processing of raw materials, grid infrastructure, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in general, EVs, including the full envelope, are cleaner than internal combustion engines. And as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner over time, it'll only get better. There have been some news stories out about whether, there's enough rare kind of metal supply to kind of build the batteries for the EVs, as well as kind of the mining impacts. And I would say there's concern there, and a lot of OEMs, BMW comes to mind kind of at the forefront, making sure that their supply chain is clean is something there. But I would also argue that, with a combustion engine, not only are you looking at kind of the manufacturing of the engine or kind of the vehicle from the get-go, you are also always going to have that environmental impact over time due to kind of the oil production process. Whereas kind of the EV, you are tied to the grid. That first production of the battery, that's kind of a once thing versus kind of a continual mining process in terms of the oil. In general, EVs are cleaner. Of course, to realize all their benefits, you do have to drive them. But I think it's a frustrating answer. They are cleaner. There's a lot of kind of subtleties within that. But even compared to, a lot of the used internal combustion engine vehicles are quite much less efficient. And so comparatively, they also are kind of dirtier compared one-on-one. I think, when you're looking at whether I retire a internal combustion engine that's 5 years old that still has quite a lot of life in it, I think you have to do that on a case-by-case basis, in a specific example. But good question.
We have another one. Can the battery-based materials be recycled efficiently?
Yeah, so that's something we're looking into. So far, there was a lot of talk in the beginning of EVs where, people thought that their batteries would degrade over a period of time. The EVs wouldn't be that useful, and then their batteries wouldn't be useful for another application. We're seeing that's really not the case, that they hold their lifetime. And I think Mark Duvall, my boss's boss, will often say it's like the handles on your car will fall off before the battery gives you any problems. There were a few lemons kind of back in the early days, but mainly that's been true. We are looking into kind of recycled applications. It is hard because there is a process when you pull batteries out of a vehicle to kind of refurbish them to a place where you're confident that they can do well in the next application. Does take quite a lot of work. So I haven't seen it applied directly in kind of a large market sense. I will say that there is quite a lot of interest now in the used EV market. So kind of keeping the batteries in the vehicles and going on to their next owner is something that we're also working on. So anyway, there's not kind of conclusive results out there. There is a potential there, but the process kind of getting it to that point has not been well established yet, and it does take quite a lot of work.
Will lemon laws be updated and applied to EVs?
That's out of my expertise. When I say lemon, potentially I was misusing the word. I was thinking of the 2012 Leaf, where there wasn't kind of a great cooling system on the battery. And so those battery packs degraded quite quickly. So I will probably punt that one because I don't know anything about the lemon laws. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Jamie.
Okay, is that good for now?
We got one more. What is the expected lifetime for the battery on the EV, and what is the average cost for replacement?
Ooh, so it depends on how much you drive it and the kind of charging you do. I haven't seen any battery replacements that have been needed. And so I think it's really, we're still in the middle of this experiment, right? Okay, so battery replacements, Bolt has its current issue where they're parked outside if the charge is full 100%, there's a couple of vehicles that have had issues, so they may have to replace those batteries, but that's not due to any sort of degradation issue. It's just internal battery workings. So I guess it remains to be seen. I think there is an 8-year warranty on the batteries currently, but if you use them for other applications such as B2G, I think it gets a little trickier there. So a vehicle to grid, or I guess probably more near-term vehicle to building, some kind of application there.
Thank you. That's all we have for now.
Okay, great. Okay, well, we already talked a lot about batteries, but I guess we didn't talk about, we did talk about battery price a bit. So yeah, I want to say that, battery packs, it depends on the size. It can range from kind of $2,000 to maybe $5,000, depending on the vehicle and when it was produced. This slide highlights how the battery price has dropped over time, and it's beaten kind of every estimate that I saw kind of 10 years ago. So what this means is that kind of the biggest portion of kind of investment needed in an EV, which is battery, is dropping quickly. And so kind of meeting that kind of price parity point with internal combustion engines is coming faster than we thought. So we're looking at kind of 2024, 2025 for smaller vehicles, and maybe a year or two after that for kind of larger SUVs, which would have larger batteries, where we'll see that price parity. So when someone goes to buy a vehicle, they will be very similar, and then they'll just have to make a choice based on kind of the benefits of the vehicle rather than kind of the price point, depending on the kind of the train, the internal workings of the vehicle. This is another trend that's happening quickly. So the vehicles that came out in kind of the earlier phase of the EVs, they could charge quickly. So that kind of DC fast charging, but they only charge at 50 kilowatts, which kind of limited the usefulness of that over kind of a long range. So it'd still take you, 45 minutes to charge your car. which if you're on a road trip, that's pretty inconvenient. So now we're seeing, those charging levels go up over time. And so now there are actually there's one vehicle on the market that presumably can charge at 350 kilowatts, which really almost brings your kind of charge speed similar to kind of the gas station model. So we're making big strides there to kind of get the faster charging and make EVs kind of as a quick replacement for the internal combustion engines. And I'm not really going to focus on medium and heavy duty vehicles here, but I do have a plot showing DC fast charging power levels, and just to kind of, so you utility folks may probably have better knowledge of this than me, but we're looking into kind of putting in kind of fast charging plazas for medium and heavy duty trucks. And you have 10 vehicles come in and they're charging each at 3 megawatts. That's a quite large load in one spot. So we're working with utilities to try to figure out what that means and what kind of planning that means, but especially on the large duty scale, they are charging quick because they have a job to do. And so kind of having the charging that facilitates the exchange of internal combustion engine for EVs needs to charge quickly. This slide gets to, another trend here, a bit at kind of what Mark was getting at. Buying a car is an emotional decision. And often when you go to a dealership to buy a car, you already have a pretty good idea of what you want. And so this plot on the left shows from 2010 to 2024, what type of EVs were on the market available for purchase. And in 2010, you'll notice there were two. And this was the Leaf and the Bolt, Bolt with a V. And they're both small city cars. Those are not what Americans drive. They like their SUV crossovers and their trucks. And so having a vehicle that can replace the one that you currently have, kind of one for one, is really the ideal scenario. Plus, has instant acceleration and a lot of other benefits. But being able to have the vehicle that you want is kind of the first step. I have 3 kids and we go camping a lot. The Bolt that I do own, I have one, doesn't cut it for most of those trips. It tends to be our second city car. But what we're seeing now is that there's this pink area here. So there's a huge growth in the SUV crossovers, which is great to see. And then we also have this small sliver, which is exciting, with trucks. And I have a full slide on that there. But really, again, offering people choice is really important, and you're not gonna force someone who traditionally drives a truck into a Leaf. It's just not gonna happen. So having kind of choices that people are excited about is really important. So if we narrow the vehicles that we have on the left side into just the battery electric, so the left side has plug-in hybrids plus battery electrics. The right side just has battery electrics. And I have the same plot, but I'm showing in the black line their average range over time. And that's another thing that's helpful. So as we get into 2022, 2023, 2024, we're seeing kind of an average range of 270 miles, where a lot of the new announcements coming out have over 300 miles. So again, offering more range, offering more choice is a really good thing when it comes to kind of seeing more adoption over time. I see another question. You want to read it out?
We do have a couple more questions.
Okay.
What sources or studies do you recommend to look into details of carbon footprint investigations?
EPRI has a few. I can send them through Mark if you're interested. But yeah, there are quite a few out there. You have to be careful because I think sometimes the full footprint of the study, I guess the full footprint of the car isn't taken into account. So sometimes they only choose certain portions of the life cycle of the vehicle. So I'd be kind of careful in terms of which ones you choose, but I can definitely send some over to Mark.
The next one is, what kind of grid infrastructure upgrades do you foresee for fuel source, as well as load leveling and emergency backup power sources?
Yeah, all great questions, all things we're working on. So from a utility perspective, selling more kilowatt hours is always great. However, not coming at the cost of having to upgrade your infrastructure. So there are lots of people thinking about how to do this in a sustainable way. Mark is talking about demand response programs, which can work great. Time of use rates also have been fairly effective, although you may get a secondary peak then later. There are also companies that are trying to talk directly with your vehicle, and you'll have, let's say, an app on your phone where you put in what time you'd like to leave in the morning and what kind of range you need, and they basically coordinate with either the grid or kind of with load, whatever your objective might be, or to avoid a certain peak time, and they will charge your car, the customer coming first. So, meeting your objective of a certain time to be ready by, but then they manage your charging kind of on the back end. So there are companies doing that. There's also companies you could talk to your charging station, you could talk to your outlet and turn it on or off. So people are thinking really creatively in places where, a lot of power is needed at one time, putting in battery storage at those places to avoid, high charges at certain times. People are doing that. And then we are thinking about how to use vehicles potentially as some kind of a source in an emergency time. That being said, it's tricky. I think you always want to put the customer needs first. And so often their way to, when you're thinking of passenger vehicles, their way to kind of leave an area or a dangerous area, let's say I'm thinking of California fires, of course, is through their vehicle. So you have to be really careful about kind of using that vehicle to power other things. But I think it can be done. It just has to be really thoughtful in the way that we think about it. I'll actually, if I go to the next slide, kind of furthering your question there, these are the trucks that are coming out that we're pretty excited about. Rivian was supposed to come out with their truck in June. I haven't seen it yet. I think they've delayed it to September now. That's a little bit more high end. I think the starting price is at $70K, and I'm sure it can go up very quickly from there. The big splash kind of in the last 2 months was the Ford F-150. And that's really Ford's highest selling vehicle. So the fact that they're kind of taking a leap and making that electric is great to see. But in light of kind of the Texas power constraints kind of back a couple months ago, they really kind of took advantage of that and highlighted the fact that their truck can power a house for 3 days. There are some subtleties to that. So if you actually want to connect to your house's grid, there's additional infrastructure that you have to purchase to do that. Of course, you could just use the outlets on the truck, but kind of talking to your emergency scenario, that's a way to do it on a very kind of local household or like appliance level. You could run an extension cord to your fridge and maybe one other thing and kind of make things work for the time being. The Tesla Cybertruck, love it or hate it. I think people do either one. I haven't heard too many inklings about it, which maybe means it's delayed. But it's definitely an interesting one. And I'll be curious to see what happens with that one. And then we've got kind of Ram and Chevy coming out with some options too. On the right side, there are some that have kind of fallen off the map. Nikola Badger, the company had some internal issues and kind of promised a lot more than they could deliver. So that one's not happening anymore. Lordstown promised that they had lots of orders, which actually weren't true. So that one's pretty much off the map. I think it could resurrect itself, but I think that one's done. And then Bollinger is kind of a very niche market. I think they'll be pretty low volume, but trucks are exciting. I think this will be interesting to see how people adopt them and how much they like them. One of the big things that came out of the Ford F-150, the front, so the front trunk that can kind of double as a cooler. So we'll see. There's some fun bells and whistles with EVs that I think people will enjoy. Okay, quick pause here. Let me check for time as well. I think we're doing okay. I have some kind of local Nebraska slides now, but any other questions?
Has there been work done to standardize charging station and rates of charging among manufacturers?
Yeah, great question. That is pretty, so so charging infrastructure is a hard one because there's so many market players with that. And states are trying to standardize it somewhat through kind of funding and rules that are tied to that funding. So I know one in California that's going out to support charging, charging infrastructure is also requiring that you need to be able to pay with a credit card. So that again provides accessibility to anyone who wants to use it and not necessarily just someone with a network. Some states you can resell electricity, some states you can't. So that kind of puts a caveat, but we did a study a couple of years back where we took all of the data from PlugShare, and actually we have another paper coming out probably in the next few weeks, and we looked at all of the costs to charge over the whole US, and actually there were 300 different charging mechanisms. So people charged by session, they charge by time, and they charge by kilowatt hour. And then within that, there were other kind of subtleties, like the first hour is, I don't know, 25 cents per kilowatt hour. And then after that, it goes up because they were incentivizing you to leave so someone else could use it. And so it's really kind of a wild, wild west for that one as well. Hopefully over time, it'll come together. In general, you see faster rates for DC fast charging and lower rates for level 2. I kind of think of that as like buying water at an airport. Of course, it's cheaper at home, but it's convenient and it is where you need it. But yeah, it's a great question, and we're hoping that industry sort of settles out a little bit. But there's people who want a sizable chunk of the market, and there are no real ground rules unless it's kind of through funding mechanisms.
Are there any EVs that are more comfortable on the highway? It seems like a lot of them are for city use only.
Yeah, so we're seeing more of those now. And I think OEMs have been trying to make them seem a little bit bigger than they actually are. So the SUV crossovers, those crossovers are often on kind of a smaller frame and are a bigger body sort of built on top of it, like the Bolt, which has its kind of new crossover coming out. It's still pretty small. So I think we're getting there. The cars are very quiet. Even my Bolt on the highway is relatively quiet, but I'll have to say I don't have first experience in some of the larger ones on the highway, but I think that'll get better over time. But the vehicle itself is very quiet.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if we look at Nebraska, their kind of new, or I guess your new average EV market share is about 1% of new sales, which is a bit less than the national average. Although there is kind of one county that's almost close to the national average in Gosper, and I think you guys could probably tell me more about what kind of what's happening there. And I've also listed here the counties that have the highest number of EVs by number, which depending on the size of the county is different than what we see in the percentage of new market share. And if we compare this to kind of your neighbors, I think a lot of times when we show stats, it's like, that's great and well, but what's everybody else doing? I want to know what my neighbors are doing. So we have Nebraska here kind of with the surrounding states. Our mapper data science person, Emily, puts these together, and it just gives you a snapshot of sort of what's happening in different counties. So you see on the left, the number of counties that have between 0 and 1%. And that's the majority of counties, where there's a couple that have between 1 and 2%. And then kind of above that, there are very few. They tend to be in Colorado and then in Utah. Here's the charging infrastructure. Mark alluded to growth, and growth that LES is very involved in. And so we see that reflected here. There's been quite a lot of, so on the left-hand side, I'm showing the number of connectors by charge level. So you see DC fast charging in blue and level 2 in orange, and this is just for public. There could be a lot more kind of private workplace charging or some kind of other private locations. And then on the right, I do it by network. So you can see, and what that means is that there isn't kind of a branded station that is kind of controlling it. It may just be kind of you'll have a brand on the connector itself probably, but it's not connected to a larger network. And you see that the biggest kind of player in this is ChargePoint with a majority of the stations. And most of the stations seem to be kind of centered around kind of the 80 corridor there. But we've seen growth in other places as well. And I think this is my last slide, and I'll do this quick because I want to make sure there's more time for questions. So my kind of bread and butter are kind of the data analytics behind them. And Mark alluded to this, but kind of where, when, and how much do people charge? And it's really still an active level, kind of active area of research. Similar to Mark, we're doing programs where, we're tracking vehicles over time and seeing, how they vary, how the efficiency varies, what kind of vehicles are more efficient than others. And this is just a sample. I can't tell you where it's from, but a study that we're currently working on where I have on the bottom axis here, temperature bins. So 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 55 to 60. And we've got different vehicle models that we're looking at. So you can see there's the Fiat 500e, the Bolt, all the different Teslas, the Nero. And then I'm showing how their efficiency varies with temperature. And you can see there's kind of a sweet spot between 65 and 70 degrees. And then as people either have to heat their cabins or turn on the AC, that tends to drop a little bit. Of course, this Model S here is looking a little bit wonky. So this is still a work in progress, but just to show you that we're trying to tease out all these different statistics with the idea that if we are going to predict what the load might look like in 2030 or 2035, we can assume a number of vehicles, we can affixate an efficiency to that, a yearly temperature, and really get probably pretty accurate estimates of total energy needed, as well as kind of power over time, depending on who the, assumptions about whether the people are mostly charging at home or in a public place. So kind of a big problem right now, not necessarily a problem, but something we're thinking about a lot. What about garage orphans? So one of the great benefits of EVs is that you never have to go to a gas station again. And every morning when you leave, you have a full tank. But there are lots of folks that live in multiple unit dwellings, high rises, where a dedicated charger isn't possible. So how do we support those people? Is it public charging? Is it requiring buildings to have some kind of a pre-wired network or pre-wired charging infrastructure in the garage? Some kind of a curbside charging program. So we're thinking about that a lot. As Mark alluded to, incentives to help someone purchase an EV for those folks who may not have considered it. And then I talked a little bit about medium and heavy duty vehicles, but they're coming fast. I alluded to, there's a process for each person who buys an EV, but with a medium and heavy duty, there's a fleet owner. And so, for example, in the case of Amazon, one person decided they're going to purchase 100,000 Rivian vans. So that's 100,000 more EVs on the road, and that's going to happen real fast. So, we're not quite sure how that's going to roll out, but we're keeping a close eye on it. And obviously the power draw from those at public charging places will be pretty large. So I think that's all I've got. So I'll end on this slide and happy to take any questions.
First of all, Jamie, thank you. You covered every base plus an additional outfield positions and just every corner of the marketplace right now. There's so much going on, and you could have gone on for another hour, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then you get into the larger vehicles, the heavy duty stuff. But Shireen, there's some additional questions.
Yeah, does EPRI have any projections for 2022 based on all of the reservations for EV trucks for 2022? What will the new EV market share look like?
That's a great question. If I could answer that question, I should quit my job and buy myself a lottery ticket. So it was interesting when Tesla had its rollout, I think of the Model 3, and they got 400,000 reservations in a month. One of my big concerns at the time was that, how are they going to have charging infrastructure that supports all of these vehicles? And you could have asked a similar question for the Ford F-150. What was interesting is I asked a Tesla person that, or someone who worked at Tesla, and they're like, well, kind of, when they do the reservations, they have to provide their zip code. with their reservation. So they know where the interest is. So it's an intel thing too from the OEMs when they do that. I'm hoping that we see an uptick in truck sales as more models come out. As I mentioned, the Rivian, which I think is the first one, well, Rivian and Ford, and they've beat Tesla to the punch, so that'll be interesting. You know, that's a bit more higher end, so it's great that Ford has come in at a more reasonable price point, but I don't know. It's a great question.
There was a question earlier about infrastructure and preparing for some of these higher charging stations. I can say that we have a case study here in town where one of our DC fast charging installations, they were getting socked with some pretty heavy demand charges, and then they put in 100 kilowatts worth of Tesla batteries, and it has had a profound impact on their demand charges. And so the customer found a solution to more optimally operate those DC fast charging systems. So I think battery combined with fast charging is going to be a real benefit to more efficiently use the infrastructure and the power needs of these DC fast charging sites.
Yeah, one thing that we're working on as well on our end is, you know, trying to figure out where these electrified fleets might be. And then also doing a grid analysis at the same time to find where there is additional capacity and where there might be problems, or kind of where additional capacity might be needed. So kind of lining up those two, you know, load shape from a fleet versus what's available, and then potentially some kind of battery solution when there's a mismatch. Or obviously you can upgrade infrastructure as well, but we generally try to avoid that one.
We have a couple more minutes here. If you have any questions, go ahead and use the Q&A box or the chat box.
While any straggling questions may come in here, I again want to encourage folks who are thinking about coming out to our ride and drive on Saturday to do so. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have a lot of different EV models that are going to be available either as a static display or to drive. And a lot of times it's getting behind the wheel and punching that accelerator and feeling what that's like. It's very, very different from an internal combustion engine, and the experience of accelerating and even the regenerative braking and the telematics, they're pretty phenomenal in a variety of different cars. So take some time out on Saturday and come by and check it out.
Well, I don't see any lingering questions here. So thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Mark, both of you, for your presentations. We got a lot of great engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Shireen. Thank you for everybody joining us today.
Just as a reminder, as Mark said, you can visit les.com/go green for more sustainable living week content, or to catch a replay of this recording. And then the EV Ride and Drive this Saturday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at Haymarket Park. Thank you, everyone.